So in this video, we're going to talk about some airbrushing basics. We're going to quickly walk through the parts of an airbrush. We're going to talk about how to disassemble, clean, and reassemble an airbrush. We're also going to go through some basic airbrushing techniques, and then I will demonstrate how to use the airbrush to do a primer, base coat, and filtering. Broadly speaking, the most common types of airbrushes you're going to see nowadays are the gravity-fed dual action airbrushes. What that means is gravity-fed, paint is fed into the airbrush via gravity, and dual action to describe the way the trigger works on the airbrush. The first action is to press down on the trigger, and that increases the airflow. Pulling back on the trigger will release more paint the further you pull back. That's the dual action. So first action is to press down, second action to pull back. You may see airbrushes that occasionally will have a side feed paint container or a siphon feed, which is on the bottom. And really what it means is that as the paint container moves to the side and then to the bottom, it requires more air pressure to pull paint up into the airbrush. More importantly as well, siphon feed airbrushes, while they can handle greater volumes of paint, also creates extra channels and parts that the paint has to flow through, meaning greater chances of clogging and areas where the paint can get stuck. Single action airbrushes, you can't control the paint with the trigger. All you're doing is you're pressing down to control the air, and you have a separate dial on the back which controls the amount of paint being flown through the airbrush. So the best airbrush you're going to want to get for your hobby needs is a gravity-fed dual action airbrush. Regardless of the design of the airbrush, they all have the same consistent parts. You're going to have the needle cap on the end right here, which protects the tip of the needle. Right behind that, you're going to have the nozzle cap, which protects the nozzle right behind it. You're going to have the main body of the airbrush, the paint cup, trigger. You have the air valve. In here is the needle spring, which helps to spring the needle back every time you release the trigger. There's the needle chucking nut, which holds the needle in place. And then some airbrushes like this Infinity CR Plus will also have a needle stop on the back. Now what this does is you can dial it in and out to cap how far the needle can press back. And it allows you to basically set a distance to limit how far your trigger can pull back, so you don't have to be as careful for when you want that super fine control. I don't tend to use this as often, but some people find value out of it. One additional thing that I have installed on this CR Plus is this quick release. So this quick release is actually two components. There's one piece on the airbrush, one piece on the hose, and what it allows you to do is to quickly attach and release the airbrush from the hose without having to unthread it. And the reason I like this is because it allows me to quickly take apart the airbrush, disconnect it, do a quick clean, and then reconnect. Without the quick release, you'd have to do this little twisty thing every single time. And that's a nuisance. It's important when you buy your first airbrush to take a look at it, understand how it works, spend some time to take it apart and become familiar with how to put it back together again. You don't want the first time that you're taking apart an airbrush to be mid-paint session when it's splattering or there's paint right and you have to clear a jam. You don't want to be panicking trying to figure out the airbrush in that moment. So it's best to take apart the airbrush, familiarize yourself with the parts, and learn how to clean it and reassemble it before you use it for the first time. Taking apart the airbrush, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Just be careful with some of the pieces, in particular the needle. The needle tip can bend, and when it does, your airflow will no longer go straight. And you also want to be careful with the nozzle, which is right underneath this nozzle cap here. So this piece right here is often made of very soft metal. It can be very easily damaged if you drop it, put undue pressure on it, if you jam your needle too far in. Certain airbrushes like the Patches Nawadas that thread as opposed to seat in like this Infinity, if you thread them too tight, they will snap. And 99% of the time, if you have any issues with your airbrush, paint clogs, paint splattering, it's going to be this nozzle. That's the first place you're going to look. So you want to be careful when you're taking apart the airbrush, when you're cleaning it, not to be too rough on these parts. I'll loosen the needle ring. So when you're mid paint session and you want to do a quick clean or rinse in between colors, very often this is as far as you need to do to take apart the airbrush. Take out the needle, the nozzle, nozzle cap, and needle cap. You flush the airbrush through, clean these parts, and then you put it back together and you can put in your next color. However, at the end of every paint session, you'll probably want to take apart the entire airbrush and give it a clean. If not every session, every couple of sessions, I always recommend a deep clean. When you're pulling the needle in and out and just water flowing through the entire piece, you're going to get paint that gets dried in your trigger and oftentimes back here in the needle chuck. And you're going to want to spend some time to clean that out. Okay, and that's it. I've taken apart my airbrush. You can see how very simple it is. There's not a lot of moving parts. Depending on the specific manufacturer and brand of your airbrush, some of these pieces will look a little different. So for example, the CR Plus has the trigger guard attached to the trigger. This makes it very easy to reseat the trigger and to reassemble. That's one of the prime reasons I love the Infinity CR. This trigger is a breeze to take apart and to clean and reassemble. Some brands where this trigger guard is separate can be a little fiddly, as you have to try and seat this in first and then seat the trigger in before the trigger guard gets knocked out of position. So you can see the spring that's usually seated with this threading in. And this is how the trigger returns to its position. When you pull the trigger, the spring presses in, and when you release, it pushes back out. So when you're deep cleaning, you want to make sure that you're clearing off the gunk in this area where the needle chuck sits, and along the spring here. You don't want this to get jammed or to have dried paint stuck in. You're going to end up with a sort of sticky trigger action if dried paint gets up in here. To reassemble the airbrush is a fairly straightforward process. It's basically a reverse of how you took it apart. You start with the spring and the needle chuck, get the trigger back in place, and then you'll probably want to do the nozzle to give the needle somewhere to seat. And just be careful again when you're reassembling the airbrush not to push this needle in too far or too forcefully. You can damage this nozzle. When we insert the trigger, we have to make sure that we pull back the needle chuck to allow for the trigger to seat. Otherwise, it's not going to have room to fit in. So the needle chuck in, so the trigger won't seat properly. Pull it back, insert the trigger. We seat the needle chuck and finish our tighten. Thread in our nozzle. Be very gentle with the needle as you're inserting it in. If it gets stuck, don't force it in. Just loosen the chuck as far as you need to. Gently insert the needle until you see the tip pop out the nozzle, and then just stop. Not too much force is needed to properly seat it. And the airbrush is reassembled. So when we clean our airbrush, whether it's mid-paint session or at the end when we want to deep clean, the first thing that we have to do is empty this container, pour out the paint, and just rinse it through. You take it to the sink and rinse it under the tap, or carry a little water squirter on hand, squirt some water in there, and rinse out any of the excess paint. You're just trying to get rid of most of the paint so that you can take apart the airbrush without making your workstation a mess. Once we've cleared out all of the excess paint, we're ready to take apart our airbrush and give it a clean. To clean the airbrush, we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need Q-tips, an airbrush cleaning tool to clean the nozzle. And it looks like it has a little sharp point, and it's entirely designed to just insert and just scrape away all the inside gunk in there. We're going to need these pipe cleaners in a variety of sizes, and then we're going to need a bunch of wires to clear out some of the gunk on the back tubes. We're also going to need some paper towel, water, and then I have isopropyl alcohol in this bottle. This is really handy to help clear away some of the more tough to remove dried acrylic paint. I would not recommend using something like Windex or acetone to clean your airbrush. Windex, because the ammonia will actually interact poorly with the brass and steel in your airbrush, and it'll over time gunk up the internals, making it harder over time to clean. It'll wear down the airbrush, and eventually you'll have to really do a deep clean or replace the thing. Acetone actually breaks down the plastic and rubber O-rings in an airbrush and will wear down those parts over time. So I would not recommend using that for the internals. Isopropyl alcohol works well. You just need a little bit of it, and we're going to be dabbing both of our Q-tips and our paper towels to clean. So going piece by piece, we're just going to clean the airbrush. To clean the needle of the airbrush is actually a fairly easy process. Again, you just want to be careful not to bend or damage the tip. We're just going to get a little bit of isopropyl alcohol on our paper towel, and we're just going to gently wipe it down. Give it a few passes. If the alcohol dries before you're done, just spritz some more on. To clean the nozzle, we're going to need a Q-tip. We're going to soak an end in isopropyl alcohol, and then we're just going to roll in each of the parts. Depending on how your nozzle's shaped or designed, you'll have to use your Q-tip differently, but this is really the best tool to clean them. And you're going to want to make sure that you clean the paint, particularly off these tips. As paint builds up and gunks up on these ends, your spray will become more and more uneven. More paint will catch on these little balls of paint that get stuck on the ends, making them even bigger, catching more paint, creating more splatter. Even during a painting session, you're going to want to pay attention to your needle caps, have some Q-tips on hand, and even some water, or just, again, isopropyl alcohol. Be prepared to just periodically clean this tip. So we're just going to soak our Q-tip in this alcohol, and we're going to roll it along and make sure we really get in there to clean that tip. The nozzle cap is fairly easy to clean. It's best to do a visual check first on the inside to see if there's any paint gunk that needs to be cleared from this hole. If there's nothing significant, we're just going to use our pipe cleaners and our wires to clear any debris or paint. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find a wire that corresponds to the correct hole size. And we're just going to run it through a couple passes to clear any major blockages. And now that we know that there's no major blockages, we're just going to use these pipe cleaners. And you can dip it in some water if you need to loosen any debris. Or you can dip it into the isopropyl alcohol as well if the paint is a little more dried on there. I'm just going to take our pipe cleaner and we're going to run it through and scrub the inside. Now to clean this nozzle, we're going to be using our nozzle cleaning tool as well as a thin pipe cleaner. First, what we want to do is we want to very gently insert this till it just seats right in the nozzle and give it a few gentle twists. And this will help scrape up any of the paint and debris inside. Once we've done that, using our pipe cleaner and either water or isopropyl alcohol, we're just going to give this thing a good scrub. When you're cleaning your nozzle, it's always good to just inspect the tip right here. You want to make sure that there are no cracks. It's not damaged in any way. If it is, then your nozzle is broken. You're going to find that cracks or breakages or any gaps in your nozzle will create paint splatter. If your nozzle is broken or damaged, you're going to have to replace it. There is no salvaging this piece. To clean the needle chuck, we're going to use isopropyl alcohol to wipe down the outside. And we're going to run wire and pipe cleaner through the inside to clear out any dried paint gunk. Because your needle, every time you remove it, ends up passing through this needle chuck, paint can sometimes get pulled in through the back and over time may dry on the inside. When that happens, you'll find the needle harder to insert. It might be a little sticky when you pull back the trigger. And so it's good to periodically do a deep clean to clear out any debris in this. So first, we're going to find the right size wire. And we're going to run it through a few times to clear any major blockages and debris. Once that's done, we're going to use our pipe cleaner. And we're going to use either water or isopropyl alcohol to just scrub through. Once we clean the inside, we're just going to give the outside a wipe with isopropyl alcohol, focusing in particular on where this piece will meet the trigger to clear any dried paint there and ensure that our trigger action is nice and smooth. Spring, easiest part of the airbrush to clean. Give it a quick inspection. If there's any paint, you just rub the outside down with some isopropyl alcohol or water, and you're good to go. Second easiest piece to clean, visual inspection on the inside and the out. Paint typically won't come in contact with this piece, so don't have to worry about cleaning it too much. For the same reason that this piece will get paint on the inside from the needle passing through back and forth, this piece will sometimes get paint stuck on the end. So we just want to do a quick visual inspection, and if we see any debris, just use our wire and pipe cleaner to help clear it out. I don't see any debris, but I'm going to give it a scrub on the outside and the inside. So this particular trigger has a couple of holes on the trigger guard and the trigger itself where the needle passes through, where paint loves to get stuck from the capillary action of just paint going backwards and from the needle passing through. To clean this part isn't difficult. You're going to want to wipe down the outside with a paper towel, and you're going to want to use a pipe cleaner to pass through and clean the inside. So first, using our isopropyl alcohol and paper towel to wipe down the outside. And then to clean the inside, we're just going to dip our pipe cleaner in some alcohol. Unless you're a messy airbrusher, this back piece will almost never see paint. If it does, you're splashing it from the outside. So paper towel, and either just water or alcohol. Just give the outside a quick wipe. This part's cleaned. So the way airbrushes typically work, there are two funnels in the main body. There's one main one that runs right down the center for your needle to pass through and where paint gets drawn into from either your siphon on the bottom, your feed in the side, or your cup up top. This one you can see ports directly through a hole and feeds right into the front of the airbrush. There is a second tube that runs directly under that and connects to your air valve. Now in this airbrush, looking at the internals, you're going to see a cut right in this corner, and there is a bit of gap. This is actually where the air flows from your compressor through your cord or cable, through the air valve, and into your airbrush. And the way that works is when you put your trigger down and you pull, it creates this vacuum or negative air pressure that forces paint through, and air gets pushed out the front. If you ever have issues with airflow, where your paint isn't being sprayed cleanly, you're seeing splattering, you've checked your nozzle and there's no issue with the nozzle, it's not a bent needle, the next part you're going to want to look for is to check if this part has been blocked with paint. What will happen is if there's any blockage there or there's any dirt, it prevents the air from flowing cleanly through the airbrush and preventing a nice, clean, smooth spray. So when you're cleaning the airbrush, you want to make sure that you're double checking this part in particular, giving it a nice scrub. To clean this, we're going to use a combination of our pipe cleaners, Q-tips, and wires. So the first step we want to do is we want to use a Q-tip to clean both the inside of this piece as well as inside here. We're going to take our Q-tip, we're going to soak the end in alcohol, and we're just going to scrub. Clear all the debris, all the dry paint, if there's any. And if you're very fastidious and careful about cleaning your airbrush often, either mid-session and especially at the end of each airbrushing session, you're not going to have any issues at all with dry paint. And you want to be careful using Q-tips in both these parts. The Infinity CR Plus is a very well machined and very precisely machined product. And so all these internals are nice and smooth. There are no sharp ends or pointy parts that are going to catch on the fibers of this Q-tip and tear it apart. Some of the lower quality airbrushes that you may find, especially the Chinese brands like Master that you may get on eBay that are less well machined or less precisely machined, will have these little jagged spots or pointy bits that will catch on these Q-tips and start tearing them apart. If you find that any of these Q-tip strands get stuck inside the airbrush, just make sure that you get a pair of tweezers and you just pluck them out. You don't want them to be caught and dried in there so that when you load in paint, they're going to get sucked through when you airbrush next. Now that we've cleaned those two parts, we're going to run a wire through the center of the airbrush to clear any debris. Do a visual inspection if you need to. I can see right through the hole, so there's probably no debris stuck in there, but just to be safe, I'm going to run the wire through anyways. And once I'm satisfied that there's no debris in there, I'm going to take the pipe cleaner, and either using alcohol or water, we're just going to thread through and scrub. You're going to want to pay particular attention to this portion right here in this area of the airbrush, because that's where all your paint's going to be flowing through. Any dried paint or gunk in this section that you've scrubbed may come loose when you airbrush and get caught in your nozzle. And you want to avoid that because that will create clogs, which ends up in splatter and you having to do a mid-session clean. So the more time and care that you take to cleaning after every session, the less of a headache you're going to have next time you pick up your airbrush to use. Now that we've cleaned this front portion, we want to clean this back right here on the inside. Any dry paint stuck in here will again gunk up your trigger and create a rough or trigger action that's not smooth. To clean this, we're going to again use a Q-tip and our pipe cleaner using water or alcohol. If you can get your Q-tip in there, great. You either go from the top or the back, and we're just going to clean in a twisting motion. Use a pipe cleaner and just give all the surfaces a scrub. Once you're satisfied with your clean, reassemble the airbrush and try spraying some clean water through. If you're still seeing some color being shot through the airbrush or there's debris being shot through, then there's still some dirt and paint in the airbrush. Take it apart, clean it again, and you keep repeating that process until the airbrush shoots clean water straight through without splattering. Once you clean the airbrush, you can put it aside or put it away until your next airbrushing session. You may find that your airbrush comes with a couple of different needle sizes. This Infinity airbrush stock comes with a 0.15 millimeter needle and a 0.4 millimeter needle. Now I have replaced the 0.15 millimeter with a 0.2 millimeter needle. I find that the 0.15 clogs way too often, and the 0.2 is pretty much equivalent in spray without the clogging issues. Depending on your make and model of airbrush and how it's designed, replacing the needle may simply just be replacing the needle, or when you want to swap the needles out, but it may be a little more involved. Now, in this particular model, every needle has its own nozzle cap, and needle cap. So you want to make sure that you're keeping these paired together and that when you swap them, you don't mix them up. I have the 0.2 millimeter needle installed in my airbrush currently. If I want to swap them out, I'm going to pull the needle, set it aside, and we're going to take this entire front assembly and we're going to hot swap it out. I'm going to take our 0.4 needle, and that's it. I use my 0.4 needle for priming large surfaces and base coating large areas. And then I will switch to my 0.2 millimeter needle when I need more control, finer spray for when I'm doing my filtering on specific parts of models. So I talked about the compressor in my Foundations Hobby Toolkit video. So if you want to find out more about what you should look for or have included in your compressor, you can go check that out. But I want to talk briefly about how using this compressor, just touch on your PSIs, what levels you should be shooting for, and then just general maintenance of your water traps. First, talking about PSIs, there's no right or wrong way to set your PSI level. It all depends on your paint dilution and type of airbrush you're running and the kind of effect you're trying to achieve. Finding the right PSI that works for you is going to come down to just experimentation. When you mix your paints and you're spraying, if you find that it's spraying too strongly, and rather than put the paint on the model, it's just pushing all the water and paint everywhere, then your PSI is probably too high. If you find that your paint is the opposite, it's sort of just splattering or it's dotting up all over the model, your PSI might be too low. I typically run my PSI at about the 40 level when I am pushing primer and base coats through my airbrush. When I am doing my filtering process, which is mostly water with just a touch of paint, I'm looking for more control and I don't want too heavy of a spray. So more often I will set the PSI to somewhere between, I would say around the 10 to 15 level down here somewhere. So really there's no hard or fast rule on what your level should be. When in doubt, set it at a modest like 30 to 40, play around with it. You're going to find what works for you. And with experience, you'll just know what PSI to set your compressor to. This particular compressor is an oilless compressor with an automatic start-stop. Because I don't run long airbrush sessions, I don't worry about it burning out. Don't really require a tank. And it being oilless means I don't have to oil the thing. So this actual compressor is very low maintenance. However, these water traps do require some care every now and again. As the name implies, both of these things are designed to trap water from the air compression process so that as it feeds through into the hose which connects here, it's going to trap all that moisture and prevent it from feeding through your tube into your airbrush. If you find that when you're airbrushing, that your paint ends up being more watery than expected or gets periodic bursts of water or dilution, it may be that too much moisture is being allowed to feed through the tube. I run 2 water traps as part of my setup precisely to avoid this reason. I know that one water trap very often isn't sufficient to filter all the water, and having a second one is just insurance. You can either mount this directly to the compressor, or I've seen some people mount this water trap to the bottom of their airbrush. No right or wrong way to do it. I find I don't like holding the airbrush with this water trap attached to it, and so I just connect it here. This thing doesn't take apart as far as I know, so we won't worry about that. But this thing will, over longer sessions, end up with at least a couple of millimeters of water stuck in the bottom, and you're going to want to empty that and give that a rinse after every session. It unscrews very easily. This thing can be rinsed out, and you're going to want to give this piece, you're going to want to let this piece just air out and dry to stop it from being waterlogged. When you have this cap on there all the time, it gets no airflow, and so moisture just remains on this piece right here. So after every airbrush session, I recommend just taking apart this water trap, rinse this out, get all the excess water out, give this time to dry, and then put it back together. When we're thinning paints to airbrush, you can use a variety of thinners. I recommend water, plain and simple, with a bit of airbrush flow improver. The reason I do this is because even with a spray booth, because we live in a tiny apartment, the ventilation isn't the best. And we have 3 cats and a dog. The less toxins I'm spraying through the air, the better. The paint's non-toxic, that's fine. This airbrush flower in tiny amounts, not that toxic. So I can use these 2 to thin my paints without any real issue. If you want to use a thinner, I do recommend Tamiya's acrylic paint thinner. It's the X20A. You can't see it because the sticker covers the label. But this is a very, very good thinner. I would recommend that you have a spray booth, wear a ventilator mask, and spray in a very well ventilated area. This is toxic. You're going to want to make sure that you avoid contact with your eyes and wash your hands, of course. Follow all the safety labels. And when you mix your paints, you're looking for a consistency that's somewhere like milk, depending on the PSI that you're spraying your airbrush. So we're going to prime this piece of plastic card black, gray, and white as I've marked in pencil. And to do this, we're going to need Vallejo's surface primer, black, gray, and white respectively. And we're going to do this to demonstrate how diluted airbrush paint will coat onto 3 different levels of primer. And I'm going to demonstrate this with Scale Colors Caribbean Blue and Vallejo's White. We're also going to demonstrate a top-down transition with these 2 colors to show you how I blend the colors. And then we're going to do a filter with Hexed Lichen on the opposite side to show you what that's like as well. So to start, we're going to drop in some Airbrush Flow Improver into our airbrush. Just a couple of drops. This is to help the primer to flow. You can skip this step if you want. The Vallejo Surface Primer sprays right through the airbrush without a problem. However, by throwing in a bit of the flow improver, I find that it greatly improves the flow of the paint and reduces the amount of clogs that I end up getting. So we're going to start with our white, and we're going to airbrush the white third. Now, much like with white paint, you're going to find that the pigment strength of the white surface primer is not as strong, and you will have to do multiple coats in order to get a strong, even base coat. Make sure you let each layer dry fully before you move on to the next layer. Now that we've done our white layer, we're going to clean our airbrush of any of the white paint. And to do this, we're simply going to squirt some water into the cup and empty it. Quick spray of the airbrush to make sure that we've gotten all the water out, and then we're ready for our next color. So again, we're going to start with a few drops of flow improver, and then we're going to load up our airbrush with gray surface primer to prime the next part of our sheet of plastic. You're going to find that when you start spraying this gray primer, it's got much better coverage than the white, and you'll only need 1 or 2 coats to get a nice even base coat. Once we're done with the gray, we're going to set that aside to dry while we rinse our airbrush. Once again with water, emptying the cup, and then doing some test sprays to make sure that we get all the water out of the airbrush. Now we're ready for our black primer. Once again, a couple of drops of flow improver, and then we're going to load in Leo's surface primer black. Now this primer has very strong pigment, and you're going to find that you won't need more than 1 coat to get a nice even base coat. I would still recommend that you do light, gentle passes when you're doing a model, because you're probably going to have to angle it and cover an area a couple times to get to all the little nooks and crannies. So you don't want your airbrush primer layer to be too thick or heavy. Just take your time and work in nice thin coats. Now you'll notice that because of the distance that I'm spraying the airbrush from, and because of the size of the needle, I'm using the 0.4 millimeter right now, that the divide between the gray and the black primer is very fuzzy. It's not a very hard, clean edge. And really, to get the control that you need for a really fine spray, like a fine line, you just need to get your airbrush as close as possible to the model and use the properties of your dual action airbrush, controlling the amount of paint and the amount of airflow that you're pushing through the airbrush to get really fine lines. My PSI on this airbrush right now is set to 40. And you can see that as I'm bringing my airbrush closer or further away to the piece of paper, I have greater or less control over the precision of my lines and dots. And with practice and familiarity with the tool, you'll be able to gain greater control over your airbrushing as well. Now that we've primed our sheet of plastic with black, gray, and white surface primer, we're going to use our Caribbean blue color to lay down a base coat. We're going to shake up the paint pot very vigorously because the scale 75 colors are notorious for separating in the bottle. Now to create our mix, we're going to put a bit of paint directly into our mixing cup. We're going to add a few drops of flow improver, and then we're going to add about a 50-50 mix of water to the paint ratio-wise to create our first dilution. Using an old paintbrush, we're going to mix the paint thoroughly and test so that we get a consistency of about milk. and pour our paint into the airbrush, and we'll do a couple of test sprays on a piece of paper towel or scrap paper before spraying directly onto our sheet of plastic. As we begin spraying, we're going to immediately see a problem where our paint mix is too diluted. You can see this because the paint is a little too watery and we're getting these tide marks around our spray pattern. And that just tells us that we need to add more paint to our paint mix to thicken it up a bit and to give the pigment a little more strength. So to correct this, we're going to put the paint mix back in our painting cup. We're going to add a bit more Caribbean blue paint to the mix and ensure that we mix thoroughly with our old brush. As we try this second mixture out, we can immediately see a great improvement in the coverage of the paint. Something you'll also notice is that depending on the primer you're using, the paint will cover better or worse. We can see that the paint actually has the best and most consistent coverage on the gray primer, but it gets a little spotty on the white or black. Much like painting by hand, we're going to do a couple of thin coats with the airbrush to achieve a smooth, consistent base coat across the entire sheet of plastic. And you're going to want to make sure that you let each layer dry sufficiently before you apply the next coat. Now that we've done the base coat, we're going to want to start with our first highlight. And to do this, we're going to empty our paint back into the painting cup and mix it in with some Vallejo white to brighten up the color. We're going to add just a touch of water to further dilute our paint. We don't want it to be too diluted because we know that the Caribbean blue pigment and white paint in general have poor coverage when too heavily diluted. Now I have not changed my airbrush or compressor settings from the primer stage to this stage. So we're still running the 0.4mm needle and our compressor is still set to 40 PSI. With the new mixture, we're going to pour it into our airbrush and then we're going to test the color to ensure that it's bright enough before we spray it onto the piece of plastic. And to create a smooth transition between the two colors, we're going to want to very gently pull back our trigger when we're spraying. What this will allow us to do is to control the amount of paint and to gradually add more color as we're spraying. Now that we've got our first base coat and gradient down, we want to take our transitions a little brighter by adding more white. But instead of putting the paint and mixing it in a painting cup, we're going to mix it directly in the airbrush cup. And to do this, we're going to put our paint drop on the side wall of the cup before adding water and a touch more flow improver and mixing with our brush. Now we do this on the side of the cup and not directly into the base because we don't want the paint to flow right to the bottom of the cup in the paint tube where it can't be mixed evenly. And to help this mix, we're going to plug our airbrush and spray some air through to create a backflow and more evenly mix the paint. Now, if you find that you want your paints to dry a little faster during your airbrushing sessions, you can use either a hairdryer or your airbrush to just spray air onto the plastic or model or whatever it is you're painting. If we press the trigger on the airbrush down but don't pull back, we're only releasing air and not paint, and this can help to speed up the paint dry times if we're a little impatient. I find, however, that if you're airbrushing a batch of models, like 5 or 10 at a time, that by the time you've finished the 10th model and you go back to the first model with your next color or your next base coat, it will have had sufficient time to dry when you add your next layer of paint. And once again, we're just doing controlled bursts of paint by very gently pulling back on the trigger to control the amount of paint that's being sent through the airbrush. And this will allow us to create smoother, more even transitions of color. So with that set aside, we're going to empty the paint from our airbrush and prepare for the filtering stage. So we want to add a shadow to this Caribbean blue color, and we're going to use our hex lichen to do this. Now, one way you can create the shadow color is by mixing Caribbean blue with this hex lichen to create a new mix of color. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use hex lichen directly in our airbrush. We're going to put a drop of flow improver and a lot of water, probably 10 parts to 1 part paint. And what this creates is a mix almost like a glaze or a very soft wash. And when we mix the color directly in the airbrush cup, we're going to put our color on the paint wall and mix it in with an old brush. We're also going to change our compressor PSI settings. We're going to drop it from 40 to 15. And you can see that when we're spraying it, it's almost like a wash as opposed to an even base coating color. And we're going to very gently spray into the shadowed areas to create a glaze of color with our airbrush. Now we want to be very, very careful when we apply this. It only takes a little bit of paint to create the filter. You can see already that too much paint creates these tide marks and will ruin the effect. So the technique that we want to do is to press down on the trigger to release the air. Very gently pull back on the trigger to release a little bit of paint before dropping the trigger forward again and spraying only air to quickly dry the color. This will give us short, controlled bursts of color, very thin layers that we can dry immediately before adding a little more. In this way, we can build up our filtering color to create a very soft transition of color very smoothly and without going overboard. And you can see we're just slowly building up the color and very slowly adding this hex lichen color into the shadows. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was informative. I hope it demystified the airbrush a bit and makes it a little less scary to use the tool. And I hope that you are able to use the airbrush to speed up your painting process. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe for more great content in the future, and you can follow me on Instagram at SirJohnTheHo. Until next time, happy hobbying.